definite energy to ground us in this space. For those who have already been doing this work and those of us who are new to this work, welcome. I'm Louis Ortiz Fonseca, he, him, his. I've been at Advocates for a little over 5 years, and glad that folks are joining us tonight. And as Sydney said, we understand that this is like dinner time for some folks, or folks who have may, be done with work or class. So this is your unwind. Let me watch some reality TV. And if you're like me, you're watching 80s sitcoms that didn't quite make it to air on YouTube. So welcome. We hope that, you'll find it worth it to share time and space with us, as we are humbled and thankful to share time and space with you all. We know why we're here tonight, because policing and police violence is an issue that hugely impacts Black and Brown young people, Black and Brown queer and trans young people, and because we have the power to organize to get police out of our schools. And a lot of that work has been happening, will continue to happen. And after tonight, hopefully people will be inspired to begin to do their work in their communities. So again, we want to thank you for being here. And we also want to honor those that we have lost violently to police violence. So I just want to give a moment for us to bring those people into this space. If those people inspire your work, if those people were your loved ones, we want to honor and make sure that our work is centered around that and the future we hope to build. Thank you, Niza Morris. I speak your name. So over the next 3 evenings, we will have some incredible speakers from the Advancement Project, Power You, Black and Pink, and our own Young Women of Color for Reproductive Justice Collective, and more. So hopefully you'll join us for, obviously you're already here, tomorrow night and Thursday, and invite y'all to do whatever it is you need to do to take care of yourself. If you have to step away from the conversation and want to catch up, do not hesitate to ask in the comment section what was covered. As we said, we are recording this, so as soon as it's made available, we will share it and let folks know how to get access to it. But again, invite you to take care of yourself, get water, hydrate, eat cookie dough if that's your jam. This is not about respectability. If you need to eat on camera, do all of that, hydrate yourself. I have my water here and my hard sourdough pretzels, but I will be unmiked when I eat them. So let's get started.
Yeah, thank you so much, Louis. I got my water, my cookie dough bites are in the freezer. Y'all, they're $4 at Target if you need to get that, because it's really good. So first, we're gonna go ahead and get started and introduce our first presenters of the night. First, we have Courtney Jones and Caro Hernandez from the Young Woman of Color for Reproductive Justice Collective, which is a project of Advocates for Youth. So while they're getting ready and queuing up their lovely presentation, I'm going to introduce you to Courtney Jones. Courtney currently works as a justice campaign organizer for mass liberation and the Vegas Freedom Fund in Las Vegas, Nevada. Courtney works to build energy within the reproductive justice movement and leads racial justice efforts at her alma mater, UNLV, and in the Las Vegas community. So snaps for Courtney for being here. Next is Caro. Caro lives in the intersections of a binational and tri-state community made up of Juarez, Chihuahua, Mexico, Las Cruces, New Mexico, and El Paso, known as El Chuco. Caro works with her local abortion fund, West Fund, to ensure folks have access to abortion care without any barriers or hurdles. So I'm gonna go ahead and toss it to Caro and Courtney.
Awesome, thank you all. So again, I'm Courtney. I use she and they pronouns, and as Sydney said, I'm from Las Vegas, Nevada. Caro, did you want to say anything really quick? Okay. So today we're going to be, go for it.
I was going to say nothing, I'm fine.
So today we're going to be talking about how abolition and reproductive justice are connected and exploring the intersections in fighting and how we fight for collective liberation. So we're part of the Young Women of Color for Reproductive Justice Collective. This is a group of 14 to 24-year-old women of color organizers who are working to educate, empower, and fight back against issues that are impacting our community through a reproductive justice lens. So if you are interested, we also have a link in our presentation on the bit.ly link. If you're a young woman or non-binary person of color, you can sign up at the link. So for our first slide, I'll be just introducing to you all reproductive justice. This is the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, to have children, to not have children, but to make sure that we have the ability to parent children in a safe, sustainable, and healthy environment. Reproductive justice means that when we talk about parents, they want their kids to have an environment that is safe to their entire family, and prisons stand in complete opposition to an entire family that is thriving and surviving because they have the choices and the access to make their own decisions. YWAC believes that reproductive justice is in direct alignment with the struggle for prison abolition. So we wanted to hear from you all. If you want to put in the chat what reproductive justice means to you, please feel free to share your thoughts, and I'll pass it to Cara.
Hi, everyone. Like Cindy mentioned, my name's Caro, and my pronouns are she and ella. I'm going to try to put our presentation up really quickly just because I was having some issues putting it up, but give me a quick second.
We got you. We're going to, Kendra, our colleague, is going to get it up for you.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us tonight. And I love your shirt.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, drop the link.
I will. I'm going to look for it. So Courtney already went over the repro justice part. So I'm going to be specifically just talking a little bit more to you guys about abolition and what it means, or the way that we define it. We at YWAC basically think that not a single entity or person should ever have control over someone else's body and future. And for these basic reasons, we think that reproductive health, rights, and justice are in direct alignment with the struggle for prison abolition. We specifically here have a definition from the Critical Resistance. And so it reads, abolition is a political vision with the goal of eliminating imprisonment, policing, and surveillance, and creating lasting alternatives to punishment and imprisonment. Abolition is both a practical organizing tool and a long-term goal. Again, just other things of why we at YWAC think that abolition and RD are directly connected is basically because we think that no one deserves to be in a cage, and that cages aren't homes. Prisons are cages, and that folks' human dignity is non-negotiable. Racism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, and all the isms and all the phobias are part of white supremacy. They all come from the same systems, and they're used to justify power and control over certain groups of people. When we are actively trying to work to dismantle these systems, we are also actively working towards a more just and equitable world that creates safety, health, and autonomous futures for everyone, which, if you all remember, that's what Courtney was reading from our reproductive justice definition. We also want to acknowledge that at times abolition can be seen as something very abstract and something that we may not be able to kind of create or have present in our lives right now. But we need to remember that, what is the life that we are trying to create, and what are the worlds that we are trying to create, and who are we trying to preserve everyone's human dignity. And we need to try to create specific practices within ourselves, within our relationships and our organizations, to try to embody these values so that we can get to a future in which abolition is a reality, right? That it's not just about abolishing physical buildings, but it goes beyond even just abolishing policing in general.
Thank you. So on our next slide, we're gonna go through how these two are related, but first I do want to give a content warning that I will be speaking about sexual violence in this slide. So prisons are a site of reproductive oppression. Okay, sorry, y'all, my computer's messing up a little bit. Okay, so the lack of access in all facets of reproductive health care can include things such as lack of medication of people living with HIV and trans folks who need access to hormones, pads, abortions, and any other hygiene products and things that they use to keep themselves clean, keep themselves healthy, keep themselves safe. Those are all facets of reproductive health care that we often see are so often taken away from them. We also see there is a huge mistreatment of pregnant people during pregnancy and childbirth, and that can come either during or before or inside or outside prisons and jails. So I'm sure many of us have heard of cases where folks are harmed while having interactions with the law enforcement, even if that's inside or outside of prisons. But that type of oppression, that type of reproductive oppression is had so often throughout these interactions with law enforcement, with prisons, with jails. There's also further criminalization of people who are incarcerated while they're having sex, where we see that things such as condoms are considered contraband. And we all know that these are things that folks that would like to have sex should have the right to, and that it only makes things tougher on each of us, especially on folks' families when they're strained because they don't have the access to things that are going to keep them healthy, are going to keep themselves, are going to keep them sane inside of a cage. So the least that they can do, we know, is to not oppress us within those facets. As well, we also see that sex workers, are also people who have a huge oppression within these prisons and jails. Overall, incarceration does continue to tear apart our families, and we all have friends, we have family that we know that are in prisons, jails, detentions, and even if we don't know them, we know that they still deserve to be in charge of their autonomy and to have freedom over their body.
We also wanted to talk a little bit of how folks are criminalized for the reproduction, and sex outside of prisons. We see that there's a lot of criminalization of self-managed abortions and miscarriages. Folks, whether currently in different states, I live in the state of Texas, and as it stands right now, there's a lot of restrictions on abortion, and one of those basically doesn't allow folks to receive any telehealth medicine or like abortion care. What telehealth means is basically folks need to physically visit a clinic and physically be with a provider present in order for them to be able to have an abortion, even if that's medical abortion, meaning the abortion pill, which is usually the way it's referred to. There's also criminalization of midwifery. Having a home birth and across the nation isn't actually legal in every state. There's a lot of states that lack laws or just licensing regulations for midwifery. And so folks who are pregnant and are trying to have a birth at home either need to find a midwife who is willing to risk to illegally help them give birth, right? Or simply have a birth without any help and just be themselves. In the 23 states that do like licensing standards for midwives, if a midwife does help a pregnant person in their delivery, they can risk being arrested and even prosecuted basically on charges for practicing medicine or nursing without a license. There's also criminalization of carrying condoms, specifically with, sex work in generally, but specifically when it comes to sex workers. If, for example, police will frequent spaces where sex workers are known or taught to be too frequent. And if they decide to search this person or their bag and they find a couple of condoms, this can basically be used as a pretense when they are charged. So they will confiscate condoms, and this doesn't only increase the risk of sexually transmitted infections such as HIV and stuff for sex workers, but it also basically helps police further criminalize them and use them in legal actions.
Awesome, thank you. So we also see that in general, we need care and not cages, and that when it comes to our reproductive health care, we should fully expect to have resources as a fundamental human right. And we should all have control over our health and our lives. And we should most definitely not be under the control of folks that we have elected. Those should be the folks that are trying to protect our autonomy and protect our body and our future, so that we have the decision and the access to make the choices that we want. Just like we resent elected officials who attempt to control our reproductive health care in the future, we have to understand that control of people's bodies in the free world is the same as the control of people's bodies inside of prisons. And so what we're doing today and what we do as activists on the daily is try to dismantle those systems of power, and just tell our legislators that try to strip us of our reproductive health access that prison systems have no right to rob us, especially incarcerated people, of their autonomy and their health. Also, alongside this, we see that the violence, ignorance, and the negligence that's embedded in racism has continued to leave Black and Brown people in poor health. And the racism and white supremacy that has led to these health disparities are never a part of the picture. It's so often blamed on the community's values and the community's actions, when really it's these systems and the history of these systems that has continued to impact our people to these days. And so the same issues we see around health and autonomy and access in reproductive justice, we see in prisons and jails. So in every institution around the country, we see that white supremacy has a stronghold over our communities and our decisions and our lives as a whole. And that is why we say care, not cages.
So we also wanted to specifically, oh, sorry, I'm still in the last slide. I'm sorry, Kinjo. Right, I know that, so a lot of people may be thinking, like, I signed up to get cops out of my school, right? Like, why am I learning about abolition and RJ or whatever? But I hope that through the beginning or throughout this brief presentation that me and Courtney have been giving, that you all have really kind of made the connection that we really wanted to start at the root of how and why all abolition and RJ is connected to the way in which cops show up in schools, or the way that they're enforced, right, into schools. You all may know or may not know, but schools with the least resources and the least amount of funding specifically for teachers, for furthering teacher trainings, college prep courses, amongst other things, and like extracurricular activities, tend to be the same schools in which have the majority population of students of color. And these are also the same schools that have the most amount of cops inside their different districts and different physical schools. This only furthers the criminalization of Black young people and further feeds the school to prison pipeline. By allowing young people to be policed and control what or how they do things in what is supposed to be a safe and learning environment, in which they should be allowed to grow, or like also known as having police in schools, and not allowing them to have access to sexual health education, we're robbing them of their autonomy and freedom in the same way that police, guards, correction officers, judges, ICE, Border Patrol, and the whole prison industrial complex in general are given control over other people's bodies in prisons. We wanted to really uplift the fact that it's just kind of really absurd to us. Absurd. I'm not sure if I said that right. That a lot of teachers or just like elected officials or people in general are very uncomfortable with the idea of a student having sex, which is why, right, there's a lot of stigma around sex ed and why nationally there's a huge lack of access to sex ed. But for some reason, our elected officials and our teachers and folk or like administrations and schools aren't uncomfortable with the sight or the fact of imprisoning and incarcerating these same youth of color, right? And actively having police in their schools. I don't know, that for us was also, when we were talking about this, was just kind of like, it's ridiculous, right? That makes you uncomfortable that people may be having sex, but it doesn't make you uncomfortable that you are basically not only keeping people from learning and from growing, but you are also like actively potentially like ruining a child's life. So again, just to highlight, reproductive justice is about autonomy, and police or schools that have police within them are supposed to be learning environments, aren't allowing students to actually engage in learning and engage in growing when they're only further criminalizing them.
Yes, thank you. And again, the two issues are not separate whatsoever. A world with reproductive justice for all can't really exist when prisons still exist. And that's why we see these movements as inherently connected. And a quote from Audre Lorde, I'm sure many of you know, but there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. On the next slide, we kind of want us to go into, thinking about where can we find money for repro resources and services. And we see that these type of issues have never been a priority most of the time. We see that policing and the militarization of our communities has been the top issues that decision makers want to prioritize. And we're so often put to the side and our resources are so scarce. And we've seen that they don't want to make improvements. They can make improvements, but they don't. So for example, someone like myself, I wanted free STI services. I wanted free condoms on my campus. And I see here on the side, it says free pads, but we know that our schools will even say there's no money for things like that, but we can't afford not to prioritize reproductive justice because these are our lives, these are our bodies, this is our future that we're talking about. And so a question for you all in the audience is, what if all the money invested in criminalization and militarization was redirected toward things that actually benefit people, everyday, ordinary people? And so we're going to be moving into the advancement project. They're up next. Thank you all so much for giving us your time. Kata, do you have anything to add?
No, just if y'all want to sign up for our newsletters that are really cool and Kendra really works really hard and we all work really hard on them, feel free to do so. Okay. But yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.
My bad. I totally forgot to unmic. You think that a year into this pandemic and my being stuck at home, I would master this, but I'm still growing. Thank you so much for that. We're going to go into our next two speakers, and we made sure that we carved out some time for folks to ask questions, to ask and answer questions near the end. So Courtney and Cotto, thank you so much for that, for grounding us and reminding us that we do not live single life issues, that all things are connected, and reproductive justice is connected to this work and to our everyday experiences as individuals and as part of our family units. So we're going to transition into our next speakers. We have Kaisha W. Penn, who is a staff attorney working for our Ending the Schoolhouse to Jailhouse track and the Power and Democracy programs. and Lindwina Bell, who is the organizing fellow for the Police Free Schools campaign at the Advancement Project, where she aids in capacity national campaigns to end policing in schools and supports youth-based political education. So if we can get a digital round of applause, hands up, waves, send energy, and welcome them to this space. So Kaisha and Lindwina, thank you so much. You can take it from here.
Hey y'all, good evening, and thank you for welcoming, excuse me, us into your space. We're super excited to be here and spend some time with you all as we build together to make police-free schools a reality for young people across the nation and beyond. As Louis said, my name is Kaisha Penn. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a staff attorney at Advancement Project, and I'll let my amazing colleague introduce herself.
Hey everyone, so excited to be here, and thank you all for opening up, especially Carol and Courtney, for your really insightful presentation. My name is Lindwina Bell. My pronouns are we, she, and a, and as Louis stated, I'm the organizing fellow at the Advancement Project for our National Police Free Schools campaign.
And just a little bit about Advancement Project National Office. We are a multiracial civil rights organization who uses innovative tools and strategies to strengthen social movements, and we support movements on the ground and achieve high impact policy change. So we have 4 major areas of work: voting rights, criminal justice, immigrant justice, and education, which we're going to focus on. And now as we talk about police-free schools. So we can go ahead and dive right into this with a little bit of history. I think, Lindwina, you want to go ahead and do the...
Yes, for sure. Before we dive right in, we just wanted to make sure that we gave a content warning. So during this presentation, we broached topics such as gun violence, sexual assault, physical violence, and police brutality. So we just want to invite you to take care as best as you can and check in on each other as well. But I'll kick it to Kaisha to kick us off with some history.
Awesome. All right, so police-free schools, the history of this, right? So we know that safety does not exist when Black and brown youth are forced to interact with systems of policing that don't view them as students, but more so view them as threats. And we also know that the presence of police in schools disrupt their learning environments. So how did we get here? And how did police end up in our schools? I'm pretending that you all asked. I'm so glad you asked. So here on this slide, so many people think that police in schools is a recent phenomenon from like the last decade or maybe the last 2 decades, but in actuality, the first time that we actually see police in schools, or school resource officers, as they like to call them, be permanently assigned to schools was on a school campus in Flint, Michigan in 1953. And after that incident occurred, we rapidly start seeing like the spread of other major cities in the United States have police or bring police on campuses. So we see that in Cincinnati, we see that in Chicago, we see that in LA, in Washington, DC, and Miami. And I remember when I first read through this, and I'm just like, wow, that has to be an obvious trend, because if you notice, these are major cities that have high populations or large populations of people of color. So later down the road, between 1967 and 1968, there was a period of student resistance where we began to see the rise of Black and Chicano students walking out of schools, and they had some demands with them. So they were demanding that they have more educators of color. They were demanding that they get a better quality of education, which is something that we're still fighting for today. And they were demanding that they get taught culturally relevant material in their schools. So while they had these walkouts across the nation, from LA to Philadelphia, students were met with busloads of police, armed police officers. They were met with violence and mass arrests. In the 70s and 80s, then following that, we have the war on drugs that was declared by President Nixon and later by President Reagan. And there's this influx of money, about $1.7 billion that's funneled and invested into police departments nationwide, which inevitably gave them the armor that they're still using today and increased the amount of police officers that we have on our streets and inevitably that we now have in our schools. So the war on drugs during that time mandated mandatory minimum sentencing. And I know a lot of people have probably heard of mandatory minimums, but if you haven't, these are laws that require, regardless of how little the offense was, if it was related to a drug, you had a mandatory minimum sentence of time that you had to serve. So it could be a low-level drug crime, but you're going to spend a significant amount of time as if you had committed let's say a harsher crime. And we are still seeing the effects of that in the racial disparities of incarceration today. We trickle down in our timeline to 1994. And I know that year is ingrained in our minds because we heard about it a lot around elections that just happened with this 1994 crime bill. But before we get there, also in 1994, the Gun-Free Schools Act was passed. And what's so important about this particular act is that it imposed a federal requirement that school districts adopt zero tolerance policies for weapons. So guns, knives, and then anything else that the school saw or felt would or could be used as weapons. And with these zero tolerance policies, we saw an increase of expulsions and suspensions and things like that. And we know zero tolerance policies directly correlate to our school or directly impacts our school to prison pipeline. But with this 1994 crime bill that was also enacted that year, it allocated about $15 billion. We're going to talk about money a few times throughout this presentation because it's so important. Allocated over $15 billion into prisons and prevention programs that created 100,000 more police officer positions. And as I stated prior, we're still seeing the effects of that. And it also established a grant program that created grants for school police through the COPS program. And then I'll let Litwina take over with the next section of the timeline.
So to continue the history, also we want to name that this information can be found in our We Came to Learn report, which we'll drop the link at the end of this presentation if you want to take a deeper dive. But to continue to build on the 1994 crime bill, there was a lot of racist rhetoric and ideology used to drive and build support for that bill. In 1996, some can recall the infamous quote that Hillary Clinton made comparing Black youth to super predators, and that Black youth were dangerous and needed to be controlled. And this is the type of language that lends to the building up of more school policing. But one central event that we really want to highlight in the history of the building of school policing is the Columbine shooting. So in April of 1999, the infamous Columbine shooting occurred where 2 white supremacist high school students murdered 12 of their classmates, injured several others, and also murdered a teacher. In response to this mass shooting, because it was the first really publicized of its kind on a school campus, there was a national outcry calling for more zero tolerance policies and the presence of more school resource officers in schools. So the community-oriented policing service developed a program called the Cops in Schools Grant, where they administered more than $750 million to law enforcement agencies across the country in order to help build up school resource officers. And the spending in this program has continued to balloon across time. From 2010 to 2016, the spending through the Cops in Schools grant totaled to $143 million. And we wanted to highlight this as a really problematic source for school resource officers for two reasons. One, mass shootings predominantly occur in white communities. However, Black and Brown communities receive the most criminalization and policing within schools. Secondly, mass shootings have not been successfully prevented by school resource officers. Most folks don't know that, most folks think that school resource officers were brought in as response to Columbine, which is true, but folks also don't know that Columbine had a school resource officer at the time of the shooting, and that school resource officer was not able to effectively prevent and intervene in this incident. You can see this as a through line to the Parkland shooting, because Marjorie Stoneman also had school resource officers at the time, but there was a bit of controversy because the school resource officer at that school knew that the siege was happening inside and decided to stay outside and kind of run for cover, and was caught on security video standing outside the school and doing nothing while he knew the shooting was happening outside. And he successfully argued his case because a federal judge in Florida ruled that he had no legal obligation, he had no technical legal obligation that would have obligated him to be in that building to protect those students. So we really wanted to demystify the fact that mass shootings are not prevented by school resource officers, even though that's a reason that's used to build on school policing, and the fact that school mass shootings predominantly happen in white communities, yet Black and Brown students are always the ones who are more criminalized in this system. During this period of time, you also see the calls to arm teachers in response to mass shootings, such as the December 2012 Sandy Hook shooting. You see calls across the country for teachers to be armed. And we wanted to highlight this as well, because when we talk about police-free schools, as we'll get into earlier, we don't just mean removing police from schools. We absolutely mean removing police from schools, but we also want to challenge all the other parts of school administration and school technology that also embody policing. So that's definitely part of our campaign as well. And finally, although there's a lot of momentum of building up and continuously expanding policing at this time in schools, you also begin to see momentum and resistance towards the building up of policing. The work of Black Organizing Project in Oakland, for example, to build a police complaint policy for police violence in schools. Similarly, in Denver, working to deprioritize school policing. These are the building blocks that build up to some of the wins that we've been able to have recently. So just wanted to highlight the recent history, but also show the recent resistance as well. Can we have a volunteer come off mute and read this slide?
The total investment made by state and federal governments and school police officers since 1999 is close to $2 billion.
Thank you, Kinjo. We definitely wanted to highlight, right, in this era of calling for defunding the police as a path to abolition, this is the reason why, right? We have schools with crumbling infrastructure, with no books, no supplies, but we have funneled in that same period of time $2 billion towards policing. So when folks say defunding the police, these are the types of things that they mean. So we definitely wanted to highlight the amount of spending that has been robbed from needed resources in our communities, such as counselors and things of that nature that were mentioned in the earlier presentation. So in order to really understand the complex nature of policing in schools, we wanted to break down the organizational structure. Now we want to mention that this organizational structure can vary from city to city. It's very complex across the country. So we just wanted to highlight 4 different sort of examples. But in order to find out, you would really have to do research in your own city to be able to determine which formation that they have. We're also going to briefly mention the policy directives of each type of law enforcement configuration. And by policy directives, we mean who's in charge of how policing operates in that city. So in some cities, it's the city council that decides how policing operates in schools in that city. In other places, the school board decides, but even on a school board level, there's a difference from cities who have school boards who are elected. So the school board members make more decisions on their own versus an appointed school board, which is appointed by the mayor, which means that the mayor has much more sway in what happens in that city. And then finally, the Department of Public Safety is also a stakeholder when it comes to deciding in certain cities how school policing operates. So the first example that we wanted to highlight is an SRO unit within local law enforcement. So some police departments usually have different units that focus on different crimes. And some of those departments have a unit that's solely focused on school policing and nothing else. So within those units, there's a chain of command of sergeants and lieutenants who patrol the schools, and then those sergeants and lieutenants report to the chief of police. And when there's an SRO unit that is within a local police department, it is often controlled by the police department's priorities and not the school. The second example is when a school district or an individual school contracts out individual police officers from the local law enforcement branch. So there's not necessarily a specific unit, but there are individual officers that the school will have contracts with who police that school. And with that, the chain of command is less clear. A third example is when a school department has its own unique police department. So if a school district operates its own school district owned police department. So for instance, Oakland used to have the Oakland Unified School District Police Department that only serves the schools and no one else. A similar chain of command with its own chief of police. However, the policy directives govern these school forces are sometimes unclear as well, or they vary from city to city. It can be the school district, it can also be the Department of Public Safety. And finally, there are some cities that have a combination where local police officers work together with school police officers to ensure a web of policing in schools. And there's a different chain of command and policy directives for those as well.
Okay, so I know we have a lot of people with us this evening from all over. I wish you all had dropped in the chat where you were from. If you don't mind doing that, you can go ahead and do that so I can see where all people are tuning in from. But we put this slide up here because we know that depending on where you live or where you're from or where you went to school, they may call school police different things. So whether they refer to them as the common school resource officer or school safety agent, as they call it in New York City, or school safety officer or community safety officer, as they call it in some parts of Florida. What we do know about these individuals are that regardless of how they try to dress it up, regardless of what name you put on top of it, we know that these are still the same armed and sworn law enforcement. that we have on the streets that are roaming the halls and surveilling our young people. So that means the same police that we protest about killing Black and brown people in the streets are no different than the ones that have direct contact with our youth, especially with our youth of color, for several hours out of the day, for 5 days out of the week. We can go to the next slide. So it's okay to call them what they are. And kind of piggybacking on something that Litwina said in one of the previous slides about how much money is being invested into police and school police directly, and how that's robbing our youth of the resources that they need while they're in schools. Here, we just have one of these stats that I think every time I see it, I can't see it enough. Every time I see it, it's so alarming. 1.6 million students attend a school with school police, but not a school counselor, which means that their school district or the state thought it was more important to invest tax dollars or money into policing students than it was to making sure that they had someone on campus to address whatever needs that students may have throughout the day or throughout the school year. We can go to the next slide. And with those numbers, of course, students of color are more likely to attend schools that employ school police officers, but don't have school counselors or school nurses or mental health professionals. More specifically, on this slide, it outlines that Black students are actually 3 times more likely than their white counterparts to attend schools with more security staff than they have mental health personnel. And I remember when I was in school, I don't recall them ever talking about us having a mental health resource. I'm not sure about you all. And it wasn't even until I got to college that I learned what the school to prison pipeline was, and that my school was a perfect example of what that was. I thought everybody's school, had a lot of security with who were armed roaming throughout the schools. I thought everyone had that same experience until I went to college and realized that depending on where you live, you don't have the same problems. We can go to the next slide. And I know that Lidwina mentioned the We Came to Learn Report and Action Toolkit. It has a lot of this data in it if you want to go back through and review some of the material. And it has some testimonials from students talking about what it's like to attend school with police officers and the fight that they're fighting for on the ground. So looking at data from 2015 to the 2016 school year, Black students only made up 15% of the school population, yet they made up 31% of school-based arrest or referrals to law enforcement. And further, Black girls only made up 17% of public school enrollment, but they made up 43% of school-based arrests for girls at the school. And this is the part where I insert, make it make sense. Like, it doesn't make sense. And we know that it's not because Black youth disrupt class or break rules at a higher rate than their white counterparts, but more so because Black youth are surveilled and policed at a higher rate and are not given the courtesy of being able to come to school and just be seen as a student. Oh, yeah, you can go to the next slide.
So one thing that we wanted to highlight in terms of some of the work that Advancement Project also does to track school policing is our assault at map. So I wanted to give another content warning for physical violence and sexual violence. Our assault at map works to document incidents of school resource officer-based acts of violence against students. And this consists of tackling, body slamming, tasing, sexual assault, sexual harassment, and things of that nature. And Advancement Project started doing this work in conjunction with some of the work they were doing to support the students at Spring Valley. I'm not sure if you all remember the viral video of a few years ago of a young Black girl named Shakara being slammed to the ground by a school resource officer. So because of that viral moment, our campaign really wanted to highlight that this is something that happens and it happens often. So our assault at map works to document this abuse and we have around 150 acts of violence documented so far, and they also happen very frequently, like weekly as well. So we definitely wanted to highlight that. So I'm gonna invite y'all to just take a deep breath here, just breathe in and out. I know that we just covered some really heavy material, and it can be intimidating, you know, the violence of the system and the bureaucracy of the system as well. But we really wanted to leave y'all on with a motivating note, just to know that youth are really driving this movement to end policing in schools, and we are winning. So we definitely wanted to bring you all into what our police-free schools campaign looks like. Can I get another volunteer to read this slide?
Police-free schools. Dismantling school policing infrastructure, culture, and practice, ending school militarization and surveillance, and building a new liberatory education system.
Thank you, Lincoln. So we wanted to highlight here in our definition of police-free schools, yes, we absolutely mean removing armed school resource officers from schools. However, we don't stop there. We also want to dismantle the entire policing infrastructure and culture, right? So that also includes teachers, social workers, or staff who also maintain ideas around punishment, around criminalization, around disposing of people. We also want to work to unseat those ideas as well. To end school militarization and surveillance, meaning metal detectors, things of that nature that greet students at schools, the surveillance technology, we also want those removed. And all of these practices will help us to reinvest in what actually keeps us safe in order to build this new liberatory education system. So as we move forward and advance this work, we also acknowledge that our work in police-free schools is grounded in abolition. So we kind of move from the frame of small is all, and that if we're able to remove police from the smaller community that is a school, we will eventually also be able to remove them from our entire communities. So again, knowing that this work is contributing to the long-term goal of abolishing policing, and our police-free schools campaign brings together abolitionist strategies for this work as a practical organizing tool as well as a long-term goal. So we wanted to highlight a few of the strategies that we use in order to advance this police-free schools campaign. And we call these the 6 Ds of police-free schools. So we're going to name each strategy and give an example. And if you can think of an example, you can also drop it in the chat. So the first strategy that I'm going to name is decriminalization. So decriminalization focuses on removing laws and statutes and school policies that criminalize students. So an example of decriminalization is that in some states, getting into a fight in school constitutes as a felony. So a decriminalization campaign would work to remove the laws that sentence youth to felonies for getting in fights in school.
The next D we have is divest invest. So this strategy focuses on identifying exactly how much is spent on school policing and demanding that those funds be divested from policing and invested in student supports and resources. So just imagine what schools could fund if they didn't fund police and policing practices. So they could have better school infrastructure, health professionals on campus, adopt and invest in restorative justice practices. And many organizations find out this information by filing what's called a FOIA, or the Freedom of Information Act. And that is a federal law that allows for anyone to request public documents. So that's on the federal level, but every state has their own version of a FOIA, where anybody on this chat right now, anybody on this call, excuse me, right now can file one of those state versions of a FOIA and request public documents. And you can request budget documents so you can see where money is going, where your tax money is going, and how much is being invested into things that you don't believe in. So like police and schools, how much money is being spent there. And then you strategize around how you can reinvest that into the community or reinvest that into school resources.
The next D that we want to focus on is delegitimize. So delegitimizing are strategies that focus on sort of exposing the false narratives that tell us that we need policing to keep us safe. So for two examples of delegitimization that we've sort of discussed already is one, the idea that school resource officers prevent and intervene in gun violence in schools, which we know is not true, given their failure to prevent and intervene in these landmark mass shootings. Also, our work at the assault at MAP, right? So we're taught, oh, school resource officers, they're friendly and they're mentors and they keep us safe. However, our assault at MAP shows that school resource officers are actually pretty dangerous for our schools because they assault children. So we definitely use that as ways to demystify and kind of debug the idea that school policing keeps us safe.
Our next D is deprioritize. So this strategy is intended to make the use of police officers in schools as an instrument of last resort, if used at all. So this looks like referring a student, let's say, who's having a mental, referring a student to a mental health counselor on campus if they're having a bad mental health day. Maybe the student is not listening in class or has totally secluded themselves. Instead of referring them to, let's say, the office or calling in a school resource officer to remove them from the class, maybe we need to refer them to a mental health counselor. Or this may be referring students to engage in a restorative justice practice or exercise who have just had an altercation in school instead of calling the police on them. So we're deprioritizing the use and eliminating the use of police in schools or referring students to police.
Our next D is demilitarizing and disarming. So we want to highlight that school police officers actually have access to military grade weapons through the federal 1033 program. So demilitarizing and disarming focuses on ending that sort of partnership from the federal level. Also includes disarming school staff and removing surveillance technology like metal detectors from our schools.
And our final D is dismantle. So this is our goal. It takes all of these strategies that we've mentioned already to help us get to the dismantle strategy. It takes different approaches to end the relationship between school districts and police departments, to eliminate school police departments, and to shrink police powers. So what do we want? We want to shrink, we can go to the next slide. We want to shrink the power that police have over youth of color, over immigrant youth, over gender nonconforming and LGBTQ students. We want to return the power that they currently have and control over schools and safety back to our communities. We want them to decide what makes them safe and what keeps them safe. We want to build an education system that reflects the society that we want to create. And it's right here in these moments where we get together that we can dream of the world that we are choosing to fight for.
Definitely, thanks, Taisha. I hear y'all sounding off in the chat, and we will definitely have a Q&A before we leave y'all tonight. So we really do want to leave you on this positive note because we are winning police-free schools. 2020 was a monumental year in movement, and a lot of the work that has been done for years in communities has come to a head and has come to fruition. So we wanted to highlight places where the youth are really leading the charge and winning police-free schools. One of the first locations we want to talk about is Oakland. So the Black Organizing Project in Oakland has been organizing for nearly a decade to remove the Oakland Unified School District's police department from schools. And they started this organizing work 10 years ago when a Black man was shot and killed by school resource officers outside of a school dance. So through the really persistent work that Black Organizing Project, also known as BOP, has been holding down for several years in Oakland, they were able to capture the political power of this uprising over the summer of 2020 and launch the George Floyd resolution. And this resolution called for the elimination of the Oakland Unified School District Police Department and its sworn officers, and to redirect the funding from that police department to student support services such as psychologists, social workers, and other behavioral health staff. They also called for this process to be community driven and for students and community members to be able to come to the table to really determine what the community safety plan will be going forward. So BOP really drove home that victory, and we really salute our folks in Oakland for working for so long to bring that win to fruition. Freedom Inc. in Madison, Wisconsin also won in 2020 to completely eliminate and remove police from Madison schools. The youth held persistent public rallies, political education sessions, and testified several times in front of the school board in order to motivate them to end the policing practice in Madison, Wisconsin. And the school board unanimously voted to remove policing from schools, which is a really huge win because just a year prior, the school board had voted to institute school policing, right, to start the contract for school policing. So just a year later, Freedom Inc. were able to successfully not only remove school policing, but also to do it in a unanimous vote where every single school board member voted to remove them. So that is no small feat. And again, this just shows the power of Black and Brown young organizers taking the vision for their communities and holding those elected officials accountable to bring that vision into fruition. And then finally, we have several locations who are also, continuing the fight and continuing to build momentum, such as Washington, D.C. Young Black organizers at the Black Swan Academy over the summer were able to have a successful win of moving the contract from school policing away from the police department and into the school system. So they're still working to disband the police completely, but being able to move it to the school system allows them to have a better strategy and chance of completely removing policing from schools. And the youth there are continuing to base build and doing youth-led monthly political education sessions to bring other youth into the fold. And we just wanted to highlight this because, as Ekaro said earlier, sometimes it's hard to see what abolition looks like in the here and now and the everyday. But young youth of color are driving this abolitionist vision of what do we deserve to have in schools? We don't deserve to have criminalization. We deserve to have resources that allow us to be safe, that allow us to be well, that allow us to really thrive. So we definitely wanted to encourage y'all, even though we're in really tough times right now, the people power is winning, right? And we are powerful together. So we really wanted to encourage y'all, and I can definitely be a resource. I will drop my email in the chat if any of y'all are really interested in driving a police-free schools campaign in your city or getting plugged into local organizing work that we can connect you to. I would love to be a resource. And these are just some handles of the larger police-free schools network all across the country, from Providence to Phoenix, Chicago, all of this beautiful work being done in our cities. So with that, I would love to open the floor to a couple questions. If folks want to come off mute or drop it in the chat.
And we did have one. I saw that I think Rashonda, you can correct me if I'm wrong, wrote, can you specifically name some of the docs we should request through FOIA? We aren't entirely sure what docs exist and therefore what type of request should be made. And that's a really good question. So it depends on your state and whether or not the law requires you to be super specific, but there are some states that will allow you to be broad. So you can say any budgets related to school funding, or you can be as specific as requesting in the document the budget line for police in the school district. So at Advancement Project, with all of the partners that we support on the ground, we do a lot of budget analysis where they will request documents from the school board or from their school districts, the budget line items, and we will analyze that for them, and then they'll organize around that and talk to legislators about, what should be divested, what divestment should happen, excuse the background noise, what divestment should happen and what they should rather be investing in. So it varies. So you can be as broad or as specific as possible. And usually they'll let you know whether or not they have the public documents available or if you need to be more specific in your requests. But all of that should be public information as well in relation to how you make your request and who you send it to. And we can also help with that. Any other questions that you all have?
Yeah, folks can feel free to come off mute or drop it in the chat.
And if you don't feel comfortable asking questions, we have tons of resources available on our website. And I know we've been plugging it all night, but our We Came to Learn report and action toolkit is going to be a really great resource for you all to start. It has a lot of valuable information in there. So if you're really trying to do this work, probably spend some time with that.
Well, while folks may be thinking about questions, and it's when I throw out, I know it can be scary to ask questions, but someone else can benefit from the answer. So hopefully that inspires people to ask.
Okay. So I see two questions, one from Alejandra C. that says, I'm a student at the Los Angeles Community College District that recently renewed a contract with LA Sheriff Department. It is ending in 6 months this June. What is some other advice in campaigning during a pandemic to get police off campus? Right, that's a really good question. There are some cities that have kind of launched police-free schools campaigns based off of the fact that there are no police in schools right now. I mean, that very little students in schools right now, and kind of use that and say, well, let's at least suspend the contract for this year so that we're not spending extra money on this, and then use that and then leverage that and continue to leverage the suspension of the contract to try to not get it renewed. And one thing that you can really elevate in a campaign during the pandemic is that there are some places where schools are using school resource officers to do checks on students in their homes for things as simple as not turning in their homework or for failing a class. In St. Louis, just recently, an armed police officer showed up at the door looking for a 15-year-old who was failing her ceramics class, right? So the fact that we're in a deadly pandemic and we're using school policing to further criminalize students is something that is really problematic, and kind of launching that to show like how criminalization is spreading out from schools to communities is another effective tool in leveraging your campaign during the pandemic. And then how do we build understanding in the communities about the harms of policing, especially in teachers? That's definitely something that we at this campaign really try to work around, because there are some places where teachers unions really do support removing police from schools, but then there are other places where teachers unions don't support removing police from schools, and that seems to be most of the case in the United States, at least. So I think one of the roles that community members can take is using using connections with teachers as a space for political education as well, leveraging the insight of parents, because there are a lot of parents who also oppose having police in schools, and using that as a talking point when communicating with teachers. But there's definitely more work that needs to be done to politicize and bring teachers into the fold, and really teach them not to dispose of students and to really invest in the wellness of students.
And that's also an opportunity to really harp on that delegitimize point of the 6 Ds, where, I mean, you talked about informing the community about the harms of policing in schools. And one of the big issues, I'm not sure if Louina mentioned this probably, with the Parkland shooting, one of the reasons that the police officer gave about, the reason why he fled and, hid during that time is that I'm not obligated to, get involved when there's an active shooter, on campus. But that's one of the main reasons that they give us to say, we need police in schools, because what about, active shooters and things like that? But they're not even required to intervene. So that's a way to delegitimize the use of them, and the fact that they're already, in our schools and harming our youth, slamming them down, flipping their chairs over while they're in them because they refuse to give them their cell phone, things that are so wild that are occurring. So we know that we don't need police in schools. We know that they don't keep our students safe. In fact, time and time again, we see that they harm them. So I think we harp on the facts. You show them the data, and we start our conversations there. There was another question. Wait, where'd it go? Is stigma around mental health one of the reasons why there aren't as many school counselors in schools? I'm not sure. I can't really speak to that. I don't. Living thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I can only imagine that there's a connection. And again, our whole education system is not really built on kind of nurturing students and their wellness. A lot of it's like, oh, we need to prepare you to go to this job, to do this thing. And there are individuals in schools who do care about students, but it's not really part of the structure of what education in the United States is meant to be. So it could very well be that it could be connected to the stigma around mental health, and that maybe the thought of that's not the role of the school to take care of, but definitely we want to sow the seeds for liberatory education systems that do take into account the whole student. And I see I saw one other question. Sorry, y'all. They have considered an alternative private police force, but I'm trying to get non-police mental health crisis intervention like some I've heard in SF. Do you have any notes or advice to accomplish this? Yeah, so some of our work has been to kind of not only push for police-free schools, but also to have non-police mental health crisis and health intervention. As we saw in Minneapolis, really quickly during the uprising, they were able to remove policing. But if you look at the people that they hired as part of this new safety force, few of them actually have mental health criteria, and some of them even most of them have a background in law enforcement of some kind. So in our campaigns, we do want to be very clear and explicit about getting these non-police mental health crisis intervention people to be first responders. And I think this can be achieved by building relationships and forging bonds with clinicians and bringing them into the campaign as well, clinicians and mental health responders, and kind of develop that into your community safety plan that you present as an alternative to what policing in schools look like. And I would definitely be down to talk more and to tie you into partners who have been able to do this successfully. And I can drop my email in the chat for anyone who wants to talk more. How are we doing on time? Just want to check in with Advocates Free to see if we can answer the remaining questions.
Yeah, feel free to answer the remaining questions. Thank you.
Okay, Olivia says, I'm interested to know how to approach discussions about police and policing in our preschool and elementary school classrooms. If you have any advice about having these conversations with super young kids, I'd be so grateful. Thank you, Olivia. Kaisha, I have an idea, but do you want to share anything on this question?
I have no experience in doing so, not with super young kids.
So it varies from city to city. Some cities will have school resource officers in their middle and high school, but won't have them in their elementary schools. But some cities do have them in their elementary schools, and they say that they try to argue that having police officers around students when they're young will help to take down the racial barriers between police and young people of color. And they basically like to argue that if you get them comfortable around them when they're young, like they'll be more embedded into the community. And this is a part where you would really want to drive home the delegitimization strategy, because we know that police do not keep us safe and shouldn't be around young children. We've had incidents where young Black children are handcuffed for hours.
6-year-olds.
There was another incident where a police officer had handcuffed an autistic student and had their knee on their back for 40 minutes. So definitely driving home that just because these are young children doesn't mean that the police will not abuse them, because they have. Policing is often about power, right? And especially in the dynamic with a younger student, they often use that as an opportunity to further their power, right? So using the delegitimization strategy is definitely one that you want to lead with in these conversations.
I see. What kinds of ways do you recommend conveying the appeal of divesting, such as ways to quantify investing in teacher and counselors? So yes, this is our divest invest section of our Ds. I think getting the data on like how much money is actually being invested in policing structure, so policing infrastructure, and dispatching police officers within school districts or in schools, seeing how much money they're investing in that is going to be like the critical piece. So legislators like to talk about money, and if we're already delegitimizing the use and need for police, we're going to look back at how much we're investing in these systems and how little they're actually contributing to schools and the safety and preparedness of our youth. And I think that using the finances there is going to be a great way of saying, you know, this is not really working. And instead of spending, you know, millions and millions of dollars throughout, you know, the state on this particular line item, why don't we invest this in making sure that teachers have, you know, all of the resources that they need to address students' needs in classrooms? Why don't we use this money to invest in restorative justice practices that have been seen to be successful in these other school districts? So I think the only way to really quantify the investing piece in teachers is to really look at what we're already spending and funneling money into to kind of compare there. And I hope that answered the question. I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that, Lewina.
No, I think you pretty much covered it. And someone added, some schools have data on what changes happen that actually bring in more money when you invest in restorative practices. Counselors, like teacher turnover rate goes down, attendance goes up. Exactly. So kind of driving home like the benefits and like the cultivation of community that results when these are implemented. And then we had a final question. Has there been more success in getting police out of schools within primary education / secondary education, middle and high school, or colleges and universities? How does messaging change between each level as we try to persuade stakeholders to remove cops from schools? So a little bit of what I mentioned earlier, it really varies from city to city because some cities only have school resource officers in their high schools and just security guards in their middle schools and elementary schools. That we do at the Police Free Schools campaign also problematize security guards because they can also be just as bad as school resource officers in many cases. But for some cities, it's predominantly the high schools that have school resource officers, though it is some of the language to remove them from places where they had instituted school resource officers in middle schools have been successful, but they kind of want to just shift those resources to high schools, which is something that we obviously don't want. In terms of the messaging changing at each level, again, because it varies city by city, it really is a case-by-case basis. But we want to just be very careful of not pitting middle schools against high schools to be like, oh, middle school kids, they're too young, they don't need policing. It kind of puts into people's that but high school students are old enough to be criminalized in this way. So we definitely want to be cautious of messaging that would further legitimize having them in high schools. And then in terms of a college and university level, most colleges have private police departments, especially private schools. And I personally, back when I was in college, I did do some organizing around removing our police department. It wasn't successful, but I think because the political climate is changing, there's more space for interventions like that now. And there's Empowering Safety DC Maryland that also works to build across schools coalition of removing private school police departments and engaging in strategies of safety. And I think some of the messaging that changes within universities is that a lot of, especially what I witnessed when I was in school, was that a lot of school cops would sort of take things, especially by white students, kind of a softer approach. I've seen white students, smoking weed directly in front of, police officers on campus and not really saying anything. So kind of launching on those racialized practices as well is something that can be used in the messaging to remove them from universities.